As we follow on from yesterday's discussion and the release of the country's very high level of crime, and as different sections of society and civil organizations continue to react to the latest crime statistics, we ask what is needed for this country to turn the tide. The statistics basically reveal that 19 murders took place at institutions of learning, including daycare centers. Meanwhile, Police Minister Bheki Cele has partly attributed the high crime levels to alcohol and drugs. But now, those that do commit crime, how do they rehabilitate, and what makes them commit crimes? Well, to talk to us and share his story, we have got Sylvester Mashilo, who is a managing director at Sylvester Mashilo Foundation. And I know that there's a word to call you, a rehabilitating offender. Is that kind of the word that we're using?
It's a very difficult and a heavy title to carry.
Yeah. But that's pretty much so the title that we can say.
Yeah.
Sylvester, thanks for coming in. You know, I listened to you speaking at a discussion that I was hosting recently, and it had to do with higher education and higher health and trying to assist university students and campuses with the high levels of rape and gender-based violence that happens there. And it just spurred on this feeling of why we have these very high crime rates in this country and what we can do to get to the bottom of it. Now, you have a story to tell. You are one of those individuals that committed crimes, and perhaps you want to briefly tell us your story and then we can get to the bottom of it.
Thanks. Thank you, Leanne. The back end of my story is one of a young boy who himself was abused physically, emotionally, and sexually, and who grew up then angry at the world, angry at a man who was raising me. And then I myself then became trash. And I think it's very easy to look at such a story and maybe stop at the point where, as a man, I always say I abused power, rank, and privilege. And what I mean by that is I was in a position where I was a broken man, and hindsight is the best teacher. But at that point, I didn't realize that I was part of the problem, that if we look at gender-based violence, that I was part of the problem. I once hit my wife, so I'm part of the problem. I cheated on my wife multiple times with multiple women, and some of those women were vulnerable women. So there was a time in my life where I was part of the problem, but it could have stayed there, and I could have been confined to the dustbin of trash. But I really had an opportunity, and it wasn't an easy opportunity, to turn around my life and go in a different direction.
Yeah. If we go back to your youth, you grew up in an environment that wasn't necessarily this nurturing environment where, you obviously swaddled with love and kindness and care and had a father to look up to and a role model and, a normal life like that. I mean, would you say in a way that your circumstances, the examples that were set in front of you, almost spurred you on to do these things because you almost thought they were normal?
Yeah, absolutely. I have no doubt about it. And I always say, if you look at men who have committed one or other heinous crime, the question that we need to ask is, when did it go wrong? Because it did go wrong at some point. But we perhaps don't care enough to ask that question, because if we asked the question, then we are a little bit closer to the solution in understanding what is that fertile ground that gave rise to this man who was once innocent, who was once a boy, but has now become this monster that we talk about. So for me, I can say it went wrong at the age of 8. And it's an appreciation of that, of seeing where things went wrong and the brokenness within me that later on was just the most fertile ground for me to also be an abuser. And I think the stats say that. Research says that people who have been abused, children who have been abused, especially men, go on in life to become abusers themselves. Yeah.
You say at 8, what happened? What was the incident that you remember changed you forever?
Yeah, and I mean, my story, unfortunately, is one that is way too common in this country. So for the first 8 years of my life, I didn't have a father. My mother had me when she was in high school, and I mean, just to get to it, my mother was raped.
And you only found that out later in life?
I only found
you didn't
that
know
out
this.
At the age of 35. Yeah, only at the age of 35. But I can tell you that what happened to her shaped my life, because she was shameful. She hadn't dealt with the trauma. To this day, she hasn't dealt with the trauma. So how does she begin to liberate me when she's not liberated herself? So it's a very common story. So she got married when I was 8, and I was told, this is your father. I had no reason to question anything. I was just a child. But this man who was meant to care for me, who was meant to nurture me, who was meant to add to my life, actually took a lot from me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that is, I mean, there's the story. You find out at 35 that you are the product of a rape. Your mother is struggling her life. This man who was supposedly your father was cruel to you. I mean, he set an example that shouldn't be. Now, you obviously now manifest this into who you are.
Yeah.
Where was that turning point? So yes, as you mentioned a bit earlier, you were the trash that we all talk about,
Yeah.
to quote your words. But what made you jump out of the trash can and say, I can't do this?
It was forced upon me. It wasn't something that I made a mental decision. In fact, I had made the decision to stop being trash many times, but I just couldn't get out of it. It was like there was something holding me into that lifestyle of promiscuity, a double life. It was forced upon me. I found myself at a crossroad where I had even planned my own suicide. So I was going to commit suicide. I was done with life. I was tired. I was in pain. I had suffered from depression for at least 2 decades. And the events that unfolded at that time that led me to confess to my then wife about my infidelity, something I had never thought that I would tell her, forced me to change. And I don't think many people get that opportunity where that change is forced upon them. Yeah. But for me, I couldn't go back to that lifestyle. I couldn't. It was part of my covenant with God to say I will live a different life. And I couldn't go back to it. And I would say it was a case of self-preservation. I either had to change or I wasn't going to be alive anymore. Physically, I wouldn't be alive today.
Yeah. I ask you these questions because I'm hoping we can help people, you know, especially when we're talking to perhaps a woman out there who the night before, last night, was hit by her partner, or this morning has just been given a nice slap by her partner and is sitting and watching this interview and asking themselves, you know, what have I done to deserve this? Yeah. But then on the other side, there is the guy who's doing this to them. What do you say to him? Like, how do you make that alarm bell go off to say, what you're doing is wrong? No one deserves this.
And that man knows it's wrong. We know it's wrong. It's not that we don't know. But perhaps we don't have it within us to fix ourselves. Okay? So you are the problem and you are also the solution. It doesn't always work that way. I think for me, I have set myself out to help men without blame and judgment. And I think that's very important. That while the world will find it very easy to condemn that man, and we should condemn the action, but there isn't a dustbin to throw any human being. I believe that every single human being has some good in them, but perhaps for some people there's a lot of work that needs to be done. What does that work involve? Some of those men are carrying traumas in themselves. If you hear their back-end story, you will appreciate how that has informed the decisions they have made today, which sometimes they don't even think they have made a decision. So I think we have to care enough to listen to the story. We have to care enough to provide that psychosocial support. So counseling, as I said to you, I was depressed for over 20 years and I did nothing about it. I just carried on from one trauma to another, packed one trauma onto another. And eventually it does catch up with you. So I think we can help men reform, but maybe we need to do it in a way that gives people love and compassion when perhaps we think they don't deserve it.
When you, obviously you're going through what you're going through, and we look at these crime statistics that we've got in South Africa, and I'm not going to ask you about murder because I don't think you can speak from experience on that, but a crime is a crime. There are levels of crime, but the reality is that people turn to a life of crime. We talk about the high, the abuse of drugs, the abuse of alcohol in this country, and I'm sure that's part of your story as well. In a way, maybe I'm wrong, I don't know. Did you turn to those?
No, I didn't.
You didn't? So you didn't feel you needed to?
They say people have their vices. Sex was my vice.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Multiple. Yeah, that was my vice.
Yeah.
I started drinking at the age of 31. So I did things very late in life. And I guess for a time, that was part of the culture. You know, going to shisanyamas, going to lounges, having a whiskey, multiple women there, and so that was the lifestyle, and it was an escape, and I guess many can relate to it. Whatever their escape is, there is something that is an escape because something is going to occupy that energy.
Yeah, so it's interesting to hear that there are those vices. It doesn't have to be drugs or alcohol. There are things that people do to numb the pain, to take that feeling away. But what about people that are born, you know, there is no hope. And that's what so many people say, is that you wake up in the morning, there is high unemployment in the country, there are no jobs. The circumstances, I mean, we've got people at the moment that are out on the streets protesting, trying to get water, trying to get education, trying to get all of these things, feeling that nobody is listening to them. And in a way, they have no option but to turn to crime, to live, to actually live. How do we address that? What do we do to sort that kind of thing out?
And unless you've lived a day in their shoes, it's very easy to not relate to it and say, well, that's not an option. That shouldn't have been your option. But you are right, people need hope. And in one small part, I have shared my story as a way to bring hope to those who have maybe been born from rape, have been abusers themselves at some point, have been abused themselves, to say it is possible to turn a new lease on life. It is possible, it's not easy, but here's the reality, and I think you've done very well to illustrate that. When you live in an environment of poverty, of crime and so on, how do you punch above those daily circumstances? It's not easy. But here's perhaps something that for me is important, that the solutions lie with the people. They don't lie outside of those people. They don't lie outside of their communities. They lie within those communities. So if we talk about crime, I would love a situation where communities mobilize for a safer and better world in their own community, because they know the perpetrators, they know the thugs in their communities, but they can also do something that says that in the majority we are far stronger than the few people who are committing all of these crimes. So I think communities need to mobilize, but do it in a way that does not in itself perpetuate violence. So we've seen with some of the operations, I will not name them, you know them very well, and their approach is part of the problem, because violence begets violence. So there is no way that you are going to sort out the problem by yourself being, lawless, by being violent, by being discriminatory. That's no way to sort the problems out.
Yeah. We're wrapping, I've got to wrap up, but forgiveness. Is your wife still with you, the one that you cheated on? She's still with you, or you're apart now?
No, she's no longer
with
me.
But she forgave you?
She forgave me.
At the time?
At the time.
And there was something interesting you said about that, because I want to talk about forgiveness, and I want that to be our concluding remark here, is that people, they are willing to forgive. They are willing to allow you to have a second chance, as long as you prove yourself. What was that like for you, to actually ask for that forgiveness, to say, I'm not the same person and I need you to help me change?
I didn't expect to be forgiven. I didn't. I think another human being can forgive you, and it may sound a bit self-conceited, but I think the biggest forgiveness is yourself. You need to forgive yourself. Because when we cheat on our spouses or our partners, our girlfriends, etc., we hurt them. But I can tell you that at least in the context of my lifestyle, I hurt myself much more. So I had to forgive myself. I had to see the goodness in me, because that's the daily reality. I have to live with myself. But when you are forgiven, it really does release a burden of your shoulders, and it's getting the type of love that you don't deserve. But to realize that it is possible to be forgiven, but you yourself have to commit to doing the daily work. It's daily work. It doesn't stop.
No, it doesn't, and that applies for all of it. Sylvester, thanks for talking to us. Thanks for sharing your story. I know there's so much more we could talk about, but if you're interested in Sylvester's story, you have a book out as well. How do we get hold of this? And I know you've got a website too. If people want to visit, get in touch with you.
Yes, absolutely. They can go onto our website. That's sylvestermashilo.co.za. Alternatively, it's available on Takealot.
Wonderful. So good. You keep on doing the work with the foundation and helping people turn their lives around. And that in itself will turn this country around, to realize that you can rehabilitate. We need to sort ourselves out in order to sort the country out. That's the message, I think. Awesome. Sylvester, thank you very, very much. Sylvester Mashilo is the Managing Director at Sylvester Mashilo Foundation.